Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we begin our new series on the history of revolutionary ideas in earnest, with a conversation with the philosopher Agnes Callard about the philosopher Socrates. Was Socrates a revolutionary thinker? It partly depends what you mean by a revolution. But if a revolutionary idea is one that has the capacity to upend established ways of thinking and ways of being, then Socrates is the original revolutionary thinker. There are probably three ways in which people might think of Socrates as revolutionary in the way he challenged established ideas and established wisdom. He lived in the 5th century BCE in Athens. He died right at the beginning of the next century. And one of those reasons is simply the circumstances of his death. He was put to death by democratic Athens, charged with impiety and corrupting youth, corrupting the young men of the city. In the end, the city could not tolerate his ideas, his ways of thinking. There's a lot of controversy about what really happened there, whether in the end this was about Socrates being on the wrong side of various political disputes, whether it was simply his disrespect, seeming disrespect for Athenian democracy. But whatever was going on, in the end, his philosophy cost him his life. In this conversation with Agnes Callard, we don't spend much time talking about that aspect of Socrates, though we do touch on it. The second way in which he might be thought of as a revolutionary thinker is simply because of some of the things that he believed, some of the ideas that he arrived at doing his philosophy, some of them pretty challenging and radical. The idea that virtue is knowledge, that there's no difference between doing good and knowing what is good. And in this conversation, we do definitely touch on some of those aspects of Socrates' thought. But the third way is the way in which Socrates approached philosophy, what is usually called the Socratic method. And that is the focus of this conversation, and it is the focus of the extraordinary book that Agnes Callard has just published. It's called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life. The Socratic method can be described in very complicated ways, but here's a very, very simple attempt to sum it up. It is an approach to philosophy in which someone is asked to state their beliefs, and then someone else, in the classic version, Socrates himself, speaking to interlocutors who are representative Athenians, not philosophers on the whole themselves. Socrates asks them questions about those beliefs, and in the process of asking them those questions, causes them, perhaps even forces them, to reevaluate the basis of those beliefs, to see them in a different light, often with very, very far-reaching consequences for how they understand the world. Socrates is often placed at the beginning of histories of ideas, histories of thought, because it's thought sometimes that it starts with him, that he's the person who invented philosophy, or what we've come to think of as philosophy, asking and trying to answer the big questions like what is justice, what is virtue, what is knowledge. So he sometimes is just there at the beginning. He kickstarts the process. This is a conversation about a different kind of Socrates. This is the Socrates who isn't just there at the beginning of some story of which we are some kind of end. Socrates is the thinker who still has the capacity to overturn, to upend what we think philosophy is. He can still shake us up entirely. That's what this conversation is about, both in his time and in ours. But we start in 5th century BCE Athens. We start by talking about the Socratic method and how it would have struck the people on whom it was first practiced, the people that Socrates was asking these questions of. Agnes, I know it's really hard to get inside the minds of Socrates' contemporaries, his interlocutors, particularly because what we know about them is partly filtered through what we think we know about him. Is it possible to say or to imagine what they might have found most shocking, most radical about what he was asking of them in the world in which they lived, their Athens? Can we say what would have most outraged them?
So I think it's a function of where you are in the conversation, like how far into it are you? What happens at the beginning is often that Socrates' interlocutor thinks it's surprising how easy a question you just asked. Sometimes they'll repeat that in slightly different words, like multiple times. Meno does this. It's not hard to say. It's easy. Anyone could tell you. This is a child could answer. This is an easy question. And then it emerges that it's a hard question. And I think the shock is that it's the transformation of the easy question into the hard question. That is, there's something that you thought you knew. It was so obvious you never even had to think that you knew it. I mean, it was like, of course. And then it becomes something that is like feels impossible to get to. And really what Socrates is trying to do is carve a space between the of course I know and impossible and show you that actually those are not your two choices. You can make headway on these questions. So like first and foremost it's that structure coming into place of you can move forward in this space where at first you thought it was obvious and then you thought it was impossible.
And it's a hard question in part because once people realize it's not an easy question, it requires something of them that feels very uncomfortable. And the thing that it requires of them is to give something up or to lay something down to which they are deeply attached. So that's almost certainly true of us, and we'll come on to how we might respond to the demands of doing philosophy in this way. But back then, similarly, is there a sense you get from the interlocutors? So I'm thinking of, so one of them, Callicles, he says at one point, you can't seriously be asking this of us because it would turn our entire world upside down. So suddenly we've gone from this being easy to, if you mean it, we have to keep going with this. Everything is now turned on its head and we can't live like that.
Right. So actually there, I think the place to start is how Socrates selects his questions. That is, he doesn't just ask any person any question. You couldn't scramble them. You couldn't take the questions that Socrates asks Lysis and ask them to Callicles. To Lysis, who's a kid, he asks, do your parents really love you?
Well, it's quite a challenging question.
Oh, it's a very challenging question, right? But Callicles is an adult and is a very kind of self-standing type of adult where like that question is faded for Callicles and it's forced. The question that Socrates pushes Callicles with, well, eventually, actually after that point in the dialogue, is like, is moderation of any value? Is it valuable to moderate your passions? But, when he's talking to an orator like Gorgias, he's going to ask him, are you able to say what oratory is? That is, can you really do it? I mean, do you have the oratorical chops to explain oratory? When he's talking to some generals, he asks them, what is courage? When he's talking to Euthyphro, a kind of religious figure prophet, he asks him, what is piety? When his friend Crito says to Socrates, he's in jail. He's been convicted. He's been sentenced to death. He's going to be put to death soon. And Crito's like, Socrates, we got to escape. Socrates is like, when should one escape from jail? There's a good time to ask that question. So Socrates is always asking a question that for his interlocutor, a lot rests on that question at that very moment for them in particular. And that's part of why things are going to get turned upside down, because my life was built on an answer to this question. Now, with Callicles in particular at that moment, Socrates has just argued that doing injustice is worse for the person who does it than having injustice done to you. And it's not just that he said this, it's that his interlocutor, who was Polus up till that point, has asserted it as the opposite as trivially, obviously true. Everyone knows it's worse to be like treated badly than to treat other people badly. And Socrates has been like, look, let's go through the argument. Let's go through this carefully, step by step. And he's able to show him, actually, it's worse to treat other people badly because then you're a bad person. And that's the worst thing you could be, is a bad person. And Callicles, okay, who is Callicles? He's a guy who wants to be on top. He's this sort of ambitious, sophistical, politically active. He's a little bit of a Nietzschean type. Maybe that's the word to use. He's sort of similar to Thrasymachus, someone who thinks he can see through the lies that other people tell themselves, and he thinks morality is just a kind of a front you put on to make other people like you, while you, if you're a real man, what you're going to do is pursue power. That's who Callicles is.
Yeah, so we might say now he's a realist, right? He's a kind of realpolitik guy.
Yes. I mean, bias is the question of what is real a little bit to call him a realist, but realpolitik is a good
political
phrase.
Realist, yeah.
And if Callicles were to think it's better to have injustice done to me than for me to do it, that would turn Callicles' life upside down. But it's actually true of all Socrates' interlocutors because of how he picks his questions.
So it feels to me like that image of it turning your life upside down. There are two ways of thinking about that. And probably the one that is too crass is that classic sort of revolutionary idea that the world is one way up and an idea or a thinker or a way of thinking will come along and it will invert it. And so what Socrates is doing is saying, kind of take your received wisdom and turn it on its head. And that's not what he's doing, because he's not saying it's the wrong way up. What he's doing, which does turn your world upside down, is saying the things that you rely on and the things that you need to be true in order to be the person you think you are, you have to lay them down. You have to lay them aside, right? And that's where the inversion comes from, because then you've got nothing to hold on to. Isn't it more that kind of feeling that he inspires in someone like Callicles, who then says, and we'll come on to this, you can't mean it. I mean, you can't mean that we should live like this. You must be joking in some way or being ironic in some way. As John McEnroe would say, you cannot be serious, because you're asking something which leaves us without the things that we need.
So I think that it's not exactly that he's asking them to like set aside or throw it away. He's asking him to subject it to examination in a certain way, where the examination might bring out that, let's say, what you really wanted was something else all along. So it's a kind of opening up of your life to making it vulnerable to the intellectual contributions of another person, and also getting a kind of clarity on it that potentially could transform it. One way that I like to think about this is something that I call the Socratizing move. So I think Socrates is often saying, X is really actually Y. There are versions of those claims that we're familiar with from sort of the hermeneutics of suspicion type thinkers like Nietzsche and Foucault and Freud, where they want to say, oh, everything that you thought had nothing to do with sex is really about sex, or everything is really about power, or Nietzsche, morality is really dressed up ressentiment, or even a lot of, like, say, evolutionary psychology, whatever. There's a familiar move we could call the reductive move, X is nothing but Y. Socrates makes a similar move, except instead of going down, he goes up. X, a thing you were doing, a thing that was part of your life, is really something very much more exalted, Y. And I'm going to show you that why, and you're going to really want that thing. Like even something like health of the body is really a mirage, an imitation, a bad attempt to get at health of the soul. So if you wanted your body to be healthy, what you really wanted was for your soul to be healthy. And so you thought you wanted power, what you really wanted was virtue, because virtue is the knowledge that would let you get what you actually desire. And that's like true power. So I think that's the turning upside down. It's sort of the turning up, the upward turn.
And yet someone like Callicles says you can't be serious. Does he say that because he thinks you can't seriously think that's what I want? So in this case, what I want is to live a life in which I think it's worse to do harm to others than have harm done to me. You're asking of me something which I can't really be expected deep down to believe. Is that what he's saying when he's saying you can't be serious? Or is he saying you can't be serious because you're sort of telling me to be different things at once in a way? You're sort of asking something of me while still somehow treating me as the person that's standing in front of you. You know, I'm Callicles, right? Callicles isn't going to be that guy.
I think that it's something like you're making an impossible demand of me. The question is, why is it impossible? Callicles comes back to this point a little bit later in the a lot later in the dialogue, after all of Socrates' argument has gone through. So the point in the dialogue you're pointing us to with the you can't be serious is just when Callicles and Socrates are starting to talk. And then at the end, Callicles says, you know, I'm kind of convinced by you, but the thing that happened to other people is also happening to me, Socrates, which is that I can't quite agree with you. And Socrates says, it is the many, it is the love for your many standing in your soul that is pushing against me. So Socrates' diagnosis, like, why can't he? Well, Callicles, whenever he talks, he kind of hears, how's that going to sound out in some other spaces? Like, how are people going to think of me if I start talking like this guy, Socrates? I mean, you can't expect me, Socrates, to talk in a way that where all those people will make fun of me, disapprove of me, not respect me. How could you expect that? That's how Socrates, anyway, is hearing what's going on with Callicles. And a way to think about that is, you can't expect me to entrust the entirety of my being and my life and my thought to this conversation. Most of my life is happening outside there where people have opinions about me.
And in that conversation, this is an example of what you talk about in the book.
the truth requires there to be two people who can, between them, simultaneously believe that they have arrived at an answer to a question, and also at least one of them doesn't believe the answer to the question, in a way that we can't do this on our own, right? We can't, it's impossible for a single human mind to simultaneously encompass that philosophical process and nonetheless still have that residual belief which makes you think this can't be serious. But in that kind of conversation, he can say, you've kind of persuaded me, but I'm not giving up the thing that I think makes me who I am. But you can say that coherently when someone else is trying to persuade you. You can't say it to yourself. So it does, even though he might be thinking about the crowd, his mates, his friends laughing at him, oh, you don't tell me you've fallen for Socrates. It requires there to be at least one other person for this version of philosophy to be possible.
Yes. So that's a great point. I hadn't thought about the fact that this moment with Callicles is akin to the moment that I spend a lot of time on in the book with Alcibiades, right? This impossible thought of like, you've shown me that I'm wrong, but I kind of still think it. But you're right. This is another such moment. And yes, I think the presence of Socrates is necessary in order for Callicles to have this thought. In effect, it's the thought, I've been refuted. And I think that we say, does the truth require it? I think that's not quite right to say the truth requires it. That is, Socrates thinks, look, you can have true beliefs without inquiring. By accident. People have true beliefs all the time. He says, lots of people have true beliefs. It's like by divine dispensation. They got lucky. They've got a bunch of true beliefs. May not stick around very long, but what conversation gets you is inquiry. So the thing you can't do by yourself is ask the question. That is, there are questions you can't ask yourself. You can ask them with another person together. The asking is a project. And what the inquiry gets you is not true beliefs, but knowledge. And Socrates thinks those two things are really importantly different in that the true beliefs are not stable, they go away, and the knowledge is really yours. It's tied into your soul in such a way because you know the reason why and you understand it, that you can say it's your own thought. Whereas when I have a true opinion, like I heard you say something, I'm repeating it. I'm like echoing what you said. That's not really my thought. It's just something I heard that I can now voice, and I'll voice something else later. So there's a way in which one thing Socrates is doing is showing you it actually takes a lot to get to the point where you can say, this is my view. It's really when the view itself is the product of having done an investigation that you can say, it's mine, I've got it, I can explain it.
So why do you think it is the case that even though we don't want to be like Callicles when we read that dialogue, and we often don't want to be the interlocutor because he makes the interlocutor, to start with, look a little foolish and then very uncomfortable. But we do follow him often in thinking it can't be completely serious, this. It has to be, in a way, there has to be another audience out there. He has to be doing this a little bit with nods and winks because it almost feels to us this is an impossible project. And part of what seems to make it impossible is there always seem to be two things going on at once. He's both showing these people that they're ignorant and leading them on the path to wisdom or knowledge, whatever it is. He's sort of taking these people completely seriously, and at the same time, he's leaving them exposed. And so we feel, and by we, I mean even reading it now, a lot of people feel he must be saying something, Socrates, other than what he seems to be saying. Because if he's saying what he seems to be saying, even to us, it feels like this is impossible.
Okay, here's a weird comparison that jumps into my head because of some reading I'm doing right now. I was reading a sort of sociological study of work on suicide hotlines, stuff people say in suicide hotline, and they report that often, but this is from the 60s, so this is old research, but they often report that when they tell people I want to commit suicide, the person laughs. So laughter is a common response to the expression of the plan or desire to commit suicide.
Even on suicide hotlines?
No.
I
So
see.
they're
I was
saying
going to say,
this
that's
on
not
the
great
hotline.
training. Oh, I see.
They're reporting,
Right.
I told my friend, and the sociologist is interested, why does this happen? Why do people laugh? And the theory that he puts forward, which I thought was super interesting, is if A says to B, I want to commit suicide, and B says, oh no, tell me about this, I want to help, whatever, and then later A commits suicide, people will come to B and be like, A told you, why didn't you help him? Why didn't you do anything? You're accountable. You need to explain the situation. You need to tell us why he committed suicide. Whereas if A says to B, I want to commit suicide, and B says, haha, that's it. He's no longer accountable in the same way. So there's a way in which, by finding Socrates funny, ironic, sarcastic, etc., we make ourselves unaccountable for the things that he's demanding of us. I think that's like one, it's like a Socratic irony is like a self-defense mechanism of the interpreter who interprets it. Because just like Callicles, we feel like we need to protect ourselves from this. Like, you can't be asking this of me. Like, I don't want to do it, so you can't be asking this of me. I don't want to be responsible for responding to your claim about committing suicide, so you can't really be making it. You can't be serious.
And what is the thing that we're protecting? So is it pride, vanity, our sense of ourselves, how we look in the eyes of other people? If you follow Socrates down this path, you might end up doing things that are conventionally ridiculous in the eyes of people. Or is it something deeper than that, that we're genuinely protecting a fairly developed view of the world, including a core set of beliefs about what we think is morality? So it's not simply that the risk of taking Socrates seriously is that we look ridiculous. The risk of taking Socrates seriously is that we give up something that is genuinely, profoundly important to us.
Right. So, Socrates is not asking you to have no beliefs or think there's no such thing as morality, or even give up your conventional views about morality. In fact, he has many conventional views about morality. What he's asking you to give up is the conceit of knowledge about those things. And I do think it's pretty deeply important to us as we walk around in the world to feel like, I know what's up. I know how my life is going. I understand what it means to live a good life and to pursue things that actually matter. I'm after the good. To have that conception of yourself, to have to give that up is really painful, I think. And to be like, no, I'm just a hunter. I'm just an inquirer. I don't actually know. Suddenly, you're living a really different kind of life. And so a way to think about it is, there's such a thing for Socrates as the best life. The best life would be the life with knowledge. And whenever you did anything, you would know that you were doing the right thing. You could teach other people your knowledge. It would be awesome. Everything would be perfect. For Socrates, the second best life is the inquisitive life, which is the life that looks towards that life with knowledge, trying to acquire it. And often, you find about yourself that you are a sorry specimen when you're living the inquisitive life. The ending of the Laches, Socrates says, one thing's for sure, we should not remain as we are. That's what it is to live the inquisitive life. And I think that many, many times we prefer the mirage or illusion or representation of the best life to the reality of the second best life.
And is it also that we don't want to be dependent on another human being for this project of the good life? And I don't know if this is a modern conceit or a human conceit. I don't know whether we can read this back into the ancient world. But most of us are pretty attached to the idea of some level of self-sufficiency when it comes with knowing how to live. And it feels very vulnerable to think that you got to find someone else to make this possible at all. I mean, it's exposing. I feel very uncomfortable with the thought of that.
Yes. So I mean, that's absolutely right. And it's good that you're drawing my attention to it, because I think that, part of what it would be to live that best life is you'd really have a mind as we think of it. You'd have in you a thing that could think for itself. But we think we've already got that. And giving up that conceit of, I am a mind, I can think things through, I can sit in a room by myself and figure things out for myself, to have that kind of self-sufficiency. That's a lot of what people mean by autonomy or freedom, is this sense of I can figure things out for myself. And yeah, I think Socrates is saying, no, you can't, because you're ignorant, and you can't, within your own resources, overcome your own ignorance. So once you take the Socratic point of view, you're thrown on the mercy of other human beings and their willingness to interact with you. And something that many people notice the fact that Socrates is really kind of nice to his interlocutors. He's, oh, wise Euthyphro, and they view that as ironic. And I think another way to see it is look, he's going to be careful to be as polite and as nice and as friendly and as appealing as possible. But often at the end of the dialogue, he never ends the conversation with, that was great, Callicles, or, oh, I learned so much from you, Euthyphro, or thanks, Protagoras. It's always Protagoras, I'm really disappointed. Euthyphro, I was really hoping for more, right? And it's at that point where he's expresses no, I put a lot of hopes in this conversation and you let me down. Everyone's always letting him down. But he still starts out with hope. And that sort of psychological dynamic of having to hope in every interaction, of thinking this is my chance, but then also realizing we don't get as far as we wanted to, and somebody has to leave, and now you have to find someone else. Yes, I think it's a lot of vulnerability. It's a lot of disappointment. It's a lot of just recognition that you're not as awesome as you like to think you are. That's Socratic humility.
Then the other barrier that we face, and by we I mean people living now, but people who've been living all the time since Socrates, is the philosophy that comes between Socrates and us, of which there is a lot. A lot of people trying to answer the question, how should we live? What is a good life? What is morality? What are the rules by which we should live is one of the versions of that question. And the way you put it, which is really fascinating and for me, incredibly thought-provoking, just this phrase. So I'm going to ask you to explain what you mean by the phrase and then how this connects to 2,000 plus years of philosophy. And then the question is, are all of these philosophers basically trying not to take Socrates seriously? But the phrase is savage commands. And the idea that human beings instinctively and also are conditioned to think that what they have to do in answering those questions is meet one or other kind of savage command. We're under real pressure to conform our thinking about the good life with pressures on us as human beings which are not philosophical. They are, as you say, savage. And the thing that's sort of shocking about that is not simply that part of this is that we think we are answerable to our bodies, including not wanting to die and wanting to be comfortable or warm or well-fed or even happy, whatever that means in physical terms. But also what you call the kinship version of savage commands, which extends all the way through to fellow feeling with humanity. That's the bit where it suddenly starts to get really shocking, that even kind of Kant's categorical imperative is a savage command. So let's start with the phrase itself. Why are these things savage commands in Socratic terms?
Good. So I'll just say what they are. So there are two savage commands that I talk about: the command of your body and the command of the group that you belong to, your kinship group. What these savage commands do is they give you answers to the question, what should I do, when you haven't asked the question? Because you might think, well, if we're not willing to inquire, if our basic condition is not inquiring into how should I live, what should I do, how do we ever figure out what we should do? And the savage commands are the answer. In general, a command is an answer to an unasked question, right? You tell someone what to do when they didn't ask you, you've commanded them. So we have these two sources of where we can get commands, that is where we can get answers to questions we never asked. And the first is our bodies, where that is feelings of pleasure and pain, appetitive desire, but also various forms of comfort and the resources that we try to secure in order to make sure that we can satisfy these commands in the future. So like the pursuit of wealth is, for Socrates, the attempt to satisfy a savage command. The other one is I call it the kinship command. I'm stretching the word kinship, the English word kinship there, because there isn't a perfect English word counterpart to the Greek word that Socrates uses, which is philia. So philia is the word for like all of your bonds to other people. So it could be your family members, it could be your fellow citizens. We wouldn't call those kinship bonds usually. Really any group that you belong to. In today's world, I would include sort of identity groups that have no geographic principle of organization, like being a woman or being gay. That's a group, and belonging to those groups creates rules for how you should be, how you should act, how you should comport yourself in the world. Okay. So when we try to figure out what to do, we're basically following one of these two sets of commands pretty much all the time. And I think the first ones, the ones of our bodies, govern a smaller percent of our lives than the second one, the kinship command. And maybe it's worth noting that, like, savage commands is my phrase. I adapt it from a phrase in the Crito. The way that, like, say, Plato talks about this in the Republic is parts of the soul. So he'll say there's an appetitive part, and there's a part that he calls thumos, the spirited, the part that gets proud and angry. That's the kinship part. So that's the Platonic formulation. Okay. So these commands are problematic, which is to say they mislead us systematically in a variety of ways, but I'll just quickly focus on two. The command of your body will tell you, eat this, eat this, eat this. And then later on, it'll be like, you really shouldn't have eaten that. So there is no diachronic sort of systematicity and unity to like how your body directs you often. And that phenomenon is called weakness of will, right? One way to think about it is like sometimes you even know that you're going to regret that you're eating this thing, but you still feel like eating it. And then your body will later tell you shouldn't have eaten it. Okay. So our bodies make us go wrong in at least that respect. Other respects too, because insofar as I'm only caring about sort of my body, I can act in ways that put me at odds with other people. The kinship command, I think the characteristic way that the kinship command sort of malfunctions is revenge. Revenge is where you're allowed to break the kinship rules, the fundamental kinship rule being don't hurt your kin. You're allowed to break them if the other person broke it first. And so that there's something that your kin can do to turn them into anti-kin, and now it becomes good to hurt them. That logic is incredibly destructive of kinship relations and of lives and of cities, right? And so here are these two forms of guidance that we take for our lives, and here are the two ways that they malfunction. And then what I say is that sort of the history of philosophy after Socrates is kind of a history of trying to tame these savage commands. That is, to make them not as amenable to the problems that they're amenable to so that they can give us better guidance in our lives. So the way it works with the bodily command, that gets taken up by the Epicureans, which is like a school of thought that developed in the Hellenistic period. And, they thought the point of life is avoid pain. More avoid pain than pursue pleasure. Avoid pain, right? So they're sort of working out a little potential inconsistency there. And they thought, look, don't always just do it immediately. Seems like the least painful thing to do. Perform a little calculation and take thought for your life as a whole. And yes, pursue what your body wants, but not necessarily immediately. That is, use your mind to introduce a kind of diachronic unity to your actions. And maybe you can already hear that we're moving towards an ethical theory that, continues to be popular today, but kind of explodes on the scene in the 19th century with John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism. I mean, we should give credit to Bentham too. We should give credit to Sidgwick too later, who develops it. But Mill wrote the book called Utilitarianism. And that's really, if the Epicureans were sort of taming and cleaning up the savage command of the body, utilitarians were just taming and cleaning up Epicureanism. They're quite explicit about this. They reference Epicurus. They're like, we are modern day Epicureans. And what they say is, look, don't just, do a calculation about later versus earlier. Think about other people too and, maximize pleasure and minimize pain over all of humanity. And what you have to do is just do the math, and then you'll be doing the right thing. And you'll be doing the right thing in a way that's not subject to reversals and regret and self-contradiction in the way that the body would have led you if you had just left yourself to its devices. So that's the story of the body. As I say, that continues to be a popular view. There's a kind of further tamed, further cleaned up version of utilitarianism called consequentialism, which says, look, it doesn't even have to be utility. It doesn't have to be pleasure. It doesn't have to be happiness, but just whatever the right set of consequences is, just bring about as many of those as possible. So the other command is the command of kinship. And, in its original form, it's about be loyal to your family, be loyal to your group. In the hands of the Stoics, that becomes something very different, because the Stoics say, well, your real kin is the kind of thing you are, which is the kind of rational being that you are. And your real loyalty should be to the whole cosmos. You should be a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the cosmos. And the thing the Stoics were really worried about was anger and revenge. And so even today, they're known as the people who, tamp down on emotions, but specifically the emotion of anger. And the thought is, understand yourself as a being that is part of a system and has to act like you're part of a system governed by a certain set of universal laws of nature. You're part of a certain kind of rational nature. They saw the whole cosmos is governed by laws of reason. All right, this gets picked up in the 18th century by Immanuel Kant, and he also is explicit about this. He says, I'm a modern day Stoic, and he says, look, what you should do, the way that you should act is you should treat yourself as though you are part of the kingdom of ends, of a kingdom of beings that are governed in a certain way by a certain kind of rational principle. And you should interact as a member of that group. So it's that groupishness, but taken to, it's like a purified rational form. And where that leads you in Kant is treat other people with respect, treat them with dignity, don't use them as a means.
Which doesn't sound very savage.
Right, exactly. So it has been tamed, I think. I think it's true, that there's some real movement here. Modern day Kantians go by a couple different names. Contractualism is one version of modern day Kantian. Okay, but we're still inheriting.
Cosmopolitan is another, right?
Cosmopolitan, absolutely, right. So today, these are the ethical theories that we've inherited are these cleaned up versions of these savage commands. First thing to notice is, they have been cleaned up and we've done some real work. Sometimes people are like, does philosophy make progress? I'm like, here you go. You can see the progress and you can see stages of it. And it really does make progress. And it makes progress in the direction of the cleanliness that is getting rid of the consistency problems. Okay, we gotta do one more because there's like the neglected child in the ethical theory family is Aristotelian virtue ethics. So in effect, if we say that Kant in the 18th century was reviving ancient Stoicism and Mill in the 19th century was reviving ancient Epicureanism, then in the 20th century, a bunch of thinkers, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, also Alistair MacIntyre later, jump a little further back before Epicureanism and Stoicism to Aristotle. And they revive a position they call virtue ethics or neo-Aristotelianism or neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics, which sort of says we can harmonize the two commands. That is, we can treat them as one command somehow. And the way that they try to do that is by saying that there's a process of habituation where, in effect, your culture can shape sort of like almost like your bodily responses. It's not quite your bodily responses, but it's your sort of your emotional responses and your dispositions as to how you treat your body. And you can come to see it as noble to withhold food from yourself if it's somebody else's food or something like that. And you pursue this thing, the noble, the kalon, the beautiful. You pursue it as being at one and the same time the thing that brings you the greatest pleasure and also the thing that makes you the best member of your group. So the neo-Aristotelian dream is that we don't have to choose, and we can sort of tame the two commands together into one command. It's worth observing that, one of the bits of ethical philosophy that has sort of made its way out of academia into the mainstream is the thought experiment of like the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is just illustrating the conflict between these theories. That's what trolley problems are. So trolley problems, if there's a whole bunch of people tied to tracks, the trolley's about to run them over, you could divert the trolley so that it kills only one person instead of many. The utilitarian says, yeah, do it. Saving more lives is better than just saving one life. Whereas the Kantian says, you can't use that person as a means to save those other lives. So even like TV shows like The Good Place have had like trolley problems show up. It's a way that the conflict between these theories becomes vivid to us. And what that sort of shows us is like we haven't worked it out yet. That is, we are still in a conflicted place. Even if we've tamed the two commands, we haven't figured out how to make them fit together. Anyway, that's the Aristotelian dream. But as I say, Aristotelianism is the least popular. It has the least grip in terms of, how much is it going to show up in an econ department, in a medical school, in law? It is a little bit now. It's getting more and more of a purchase, but you're much more going to see utilitarianism or Kantianism in those places. So in terms of what escapes from academia, virtue ethics is the youngest, newest member. And maybe I'll just add, like, what I take myself to be doing is just, in a way, the next logical step. I'm a 21st century thinker, and I'm going back to Socrates, and I'm saying there's a fourth menu item, Socratic intellectualism. It's different. It doesn't tell you to pursue utility. It doesn't tell you to treat people with respect or do your duty, like Kantianism does. It doesn't tell you pursue the noble. What it tells you to do is pursue knowledge. And that's really a different directive. It organizes your whole life differently, et cetera. Okay, so I'm sorry that was a lengthy answer, but I kind of had to go through the whole thing. And so, what the intervening 2,000 years of philosophy, 2,500 years have done is to take some of these things that Socrates was grappling with, these like really bad sources of how to live your life, and improve them. And I think we should say, thanks, philosophy. That's a real benefit.
It's better to live now than in the 18th century, partly because of Bentham and utilitarianism,
Exactly.
right? We don't execute people because they have gay sex.
Exactly. Right. So like there are just concrete improvements to human life. And it's better to live now in a world where we have like human rights because we believe in human dignity because we've been influenced by Kant. So, and I don't want to say that there are no other influences here, by the way. I mean, these are very bold, sweeping claims of the history of philosophy, and certainly like Christianity is going to be an important data point for getting to Kant. But in any case, like concrete improvements to human life because of the changes that we've made in relation to these savage commands. There's a way in which the Socratic point stands. That is the point that he was making in response to people who were putting forward the original, untamed versions of these commands is, well, but what about you actually just try to ask the question instead? That is, instead of accepting an answer that is given to you as a command from an unreliable source, you open up the question for yourself. And the way Plato puts this point is there's a third part of the soul, the rational part, where you can say, what should I do? That is where you can actually raise the question. And so Socratic ethics is about that third space, opening it up and seeing how if we sort of allow it to, it could direct our lives.
And so you could say, because of all of that, that the 2,500 years of philosophy is not taking Socrates seriously. So you say it's a fourth version, but actually it's the first version. It has to come first. It's not like the thing that you come to after you've done these things. It comes first. And then these things are ways of saying, well, even if we believe that there's a rational way of doing this and we can ask these questions philosophically, don't we have to tidy all that other stuff up first? Won't all that other stuff get in the way unless we tame it, unless we have a set of rules? That this thing that we call philosophy isn't just going to sort of break out spontaneously. We need a tamed world in order for that to be possible. And I think instinctively most people probably still believe that. It feels like Socrates is going in early and big with like, this is possible.
Yeah.
And but we understand now, partly thanks to Socrates, that we're really in the grip of these things, these instincts, these commands, these bodily desires, this wish to be better people and respect other human beings, this wish to be cosmopolitans, whatever it is. So we need to get all that sorted first. And part of the radicalism, as I understand it, of Socrates is he's saying, no, we don't do that first. If you do that first, you're lost, because you're then going down the path of prejudging the answers to the questions that need to be asked. You have to ask the questions first. That's the essential radicalism of Socrates.
So I don't know if I agree about that. That is, I think Socrates would have been delighted if there had been some utilitarians and Kantians around to argue with, but not just to argue with, but to influence the world around him.
So he wouldn't have been disappointed if Kant had been his interlocutor.
No,
He'd have been thrilled, would he?
He would have been thrilled.
Because I kind of got the feeling from your book that he might have been a bit disappointed, because he would say, yeah, but you've prejudged something that needs to be open to question.
He would have loved to have that conversation with Kant, is what I'm saying. Kant is the person with whom, look, all Socrates ever did is say, but, and he would have wanted to say that to Kant. But I also just think it's not just the question of the conversation with Kant, but also it's really hard to have the kinds of conversations that Socrates wanted to have. He saw that it was hard. He saw, for instance, that he couldn't have them in the assembly. Callicles says, why are you always whispering in the corner with 3 or 4 boys? Like, why don't you go out where men do manly things and stand up in the assembly and tell everybody how to live, or have a philosophical dialogue or whatever? And Socrates is like, I would have just been killed really fast if I did that. This way I was killed a lot slower. And these commands are a fact of life. It's not like we can pretend that they're not there. It's not like we can pretend that we don't hear these voices sort of shouting at us. And it might be that if you're sort of an extraordinary individual like Socrates, then you have sort of an ability to get the rational possibilities so clearly in view, even in a very savage world, that you're able to conduct some of these inquiries. And that was just the kind of miracle of Socrates, so miraculous that, like a generation of people invented the genre, the Socratic dialogue, and said, we can't lose this. We can't forget that this guy showed up and that he did this thing that seems incredible. We can hardly believe it. It seems impossible. And I think the sort of, in a way, the conclusion to draw from the line of reasoning that you were presenting is like, what's our excuse now? Because now we're living in a way less savage world. Our basic bodily needs are sort of satisfied, or like likely to be pretty well satisfied for like any listener to this podcast. And yes, we can get caught up in questions of status and acclaim, but we can also let ourselves get less caught up in them.
And they're less life and death than they were.
Exactly. That's why we can let ourselves get less caught up in them.
Academics should remember that sometimes.
Yes. And so that in a way, it's not just Socrates, but it's also Kant and Mill that have paved the way for Socratic intellectualism to be something more like a mainstream view, like a mainstream ethical approach, that the kind of space that Socrates was able to find in conversations with sort of everyday, with young people, old people, et cetera, we could find them in our lives now. We could sort of open out our conversations a little bit. We're not going to immediately die. And so we shouldn't act like we might.
That then becomes a question, though, about politics. And this is also something that you write about. And again, you use a really memorable phrase. I'm paraphrasing you, but what's gone wrong with our politics is it's become politicized. That's one of the things that you say. And one of the things I take that to mean is the politicization of politics has squeezed the space for that sort of inquiry between human beings trying to work out how we should live collectively, or what it would be for this society to be just, or whatever it is. And it's become politicized. I understand that phrase to mean, because we've prejudged the answers before we ask the questions, which is the thing that Socrates was desperately encouraging us not to do, because you're doomed at that point in a way. It ends up either as rage or futility, or you just walk away from it. You've got to genuinely be open. But it does also sound a little paradoxical. Maybe it's just paradoxical because of the way that the language has evolved. But if the problem with politics is that it's politicized, what then is the politics that we need, a depoliticized politics? Because I think most of us instinctively feel politics without politicization is quite an ask.
Yes, I agree. So I do think of politicization as a pathology of politics, and thus that you don't actually need to always be politicizing everything. One way to see, I mean, even the word politics can be used as a pathology. Like people say, politicians will say, let's keep politics out of this, right? And they mean, let's keep politicization out of this.
Or enough with the office politics. Let's get on with the business of doing our jobs.
Exactly. And that's a thing we can do, right? So it's that contrast between those two things. It might be worth it for me to just step back and say what I mean by politicization. You're right that it involves prejudging the answers to questions, but it's slightly more specific than that. And I think it's worth sort of saying, because a lot of people use politicization to mean polarization, where like people divide into two camps and they strongly disagree. And I don't think that's a problem. That is, in philosophy, it often happens that there's like, people who believe in free will, people who don't believe in free will, and they can have a great conversation about that. It's not somehow better if they spread over this big range of views. That might also be fine. But
or utilitarians and Kantians, right? They can argue it out.
Exactly. No one in philosophy bemoans the fact that why are philosophers divided into utilitarians and Kantians? Why can't we all just have the same view? No one thinks that. But even outside of philosophy, take a movie, some movies where everyone's like, yeah, it's kind of okay. And then another movie polarizes people in the sense that some people are like, I love this, the best movie I ever saw. And then other people are like, this is the worst movie I've ever seen. And you might want to see that movie rather than the one that everyone thought was okay. Polarization doesn't seem that bad. So we should wonder, why does it suddenly seem bad to us in the case of politics? And I think it's not the polarization that's bad. It's the politicization. And that's because there's some question and it has been mapped onto a kind of zero-sum game where the thought is, I'm trying to defeat you or score points against you. And if I score certain points, then my side, my view somehow wins. And so instead of having an inquiry into the question that we disagree on, for instance, utilitarianism versus Kantianism, I am sort of making moves in a symbolic game that, let's say you're the Kantian, make the Kantian look bad, but don't actually indicate the Kantianism is false. It's that sort of transferal of the argument into a context where you can't argue it out. That's politicization.
That's the end of the first part of this conversation, but it's not the end of the conversation because, as many conversations do, this one overspilled, and Agnes Callard and I found that we had lots more that we wanted to talk about. So we have actually broken this conversation into two parts. And the second part will be available tomorrow. We're going to put it on PPF Plus. So in order to hear it, you will need to subscribe. Subscribing is very easy. You just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com, and it will tell you how. The second part of this conversation picks up on where we left off. So we carry on talking about the politicization and what it might mean to depoliticize politics. But we talk about quite a lot of other things too, including artificial intelligence, therapy, how philosophy might help us with death, even the fear of parties. Here's a taster.
What I was really struck by when I read that account that you gave in the book of how this often happens the first time, you meet someone at a party, for instance, and parties are places where there is sort of status-based equality or whatever you want to call it, is there's a part of me that thought the reason this is just too demanding, particularly as a political ideal of how we should engage in the business of persuading or being persuaded, is that there's probably not enough trust between people to do it, in the sense that you sort of feel like it's quite a brave endeavor to open up our views, our strongly held political beliefs to this kind of exchange. And we probably feel like we want to find people, the right people to do it with, not just random strangers. Mm-hmm. And I know in a way Socrates did it with random strangers, but he had status, right? He was Socrates, so people were willing to do it with him because he was the famous Socrates. But actually that example of a party is a good example. So I am persuaded by this, actually, that it doesn't presuppose trust. Actually, the pursuit of trust is probably the barrier in the way of it. Trust is a really hard thing to build. And if you wait for trust before you do the business of asking, what should we do? You might end up waiting a long time. And I think it is true that some of the most interesting conversations that we have are with people we've never met before because we're feeling each other out. And that, unlike trust, is spontaneous. And trust is a bit of a deadener, the pursuit of trust for this kind of philosophy. Am I right?
To hear that conversation, sign up to PPF Plus now. And a reminder that Agnes Callard's book is also out now. It's called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life. We don't normally talk about the latest books on this podcast. We're not a book promotion podcast at all. So I mean it when I say that this is one of the most thought-provoking books that I have read for a very, very long time. And I can't say more than that I really recommend it. Next time in our regular slot, the next revolutionary idea that we consider is another big one, Christianity. In conversation with the historian and podcaster, he will be very well known to many of you, Tom Holland. Do join us for that. Past Present Future is brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past Present Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.